we're live. Okay. So, admittedly, I have never done a Substack live before. So, this could be a real train wreck, or it could be great fun. And so, I appreciate you all being my little guinea pigs. And, oh, it looks like good. Okay. Jim is going to join me. We are a little bit novices on this. The thing is, even if you are a digital historian like Jim, sometimes new technology is actually not the most convenient situation when you are spending most of your time in the 18th century. As I like to say, sometimes dead people are much easier to deal with than those that are alive. So we are here. Those that are present with us have just heard that this is my first Substack Live, and so I am thanking them for being guinea pigs. And so far, I feel like if you all could in the chat let me know, do you see two faces? I'm going to call that a success. If so, we're over there, two faces, two people. Yay. Great
I think
start.
we just go home. We're done.
It's a win, and okay, it's working. Marvelous. Love this. Thank you guys for commenting. Anyone feel like they would like a redo on 2026? Because that's how I'm currently feeling, and tonight's not helping. All right. We are officially starting over again. Thank you all for joining the Substack Live on the 250th anniversary of Common Sense, which will be later this week. It's kind of the kickoff of the 2026 anniversaries, although we at Mount Vernon have been celebrating the 250th anniversaries for almost a full year now because Washington took command of the Continental Army in July of 2025. So at this point, we're old hats at these celebrations. Our goal for today is to talk about Common Sense, its origins, who wrote it, why it was important, some other ramifications, and then 250th celebrations. It will very much be a conversation. I'm going to stop talking in a second. But before I do, for those of you who don't know Jim, I was just looking up your new title, which I love. It's the Director of Digital History at More Perfect. And More Perfect has been wonderful partners to us at the George Washington Presidential Library. They are an organization that really is focused on doing the actual work of trying to improve democracy through 5 pillars. See if I can remember them. It's always a bit of a test. So let's see. Civics education, trusted local news, bridging divides, safe and secure elections. It's always the last one.
And I'm too new to help you, so I don't know.
Crap. Okay. Colleen and Bridge. Cover your ears. I will get the last one. Anyway, they're a wonderful organization. Volunteerism. Thank you, Colleen. So service is so important. So we are thrilled that we are doing this project together. And Jim will tell you more about the In Pursuit project, which he and the wonderful Colleen Shogan are working on together, that I'm a part of. We'll talk about that more later. So you're also a fantastic historian in your own right of the American Revolution, in particular, the sort of Scottish elements, which I think are so fascinating, and a longtime friend. For those of you who have read The Cabinet, which is behind me, you can see in the acknowledgments that I called Jim. I think I called you a very excellent chap. So longtime friend. So this has been this is great. Thank you for being my first Substack Live friend.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we are going to talk a little bit about the context of Common Sense and Thomas Paine. You want to kick us off with who was Tom Paine? What was his origin story? And why did he come to be this important figure?
Thomas Paine is a fascinating figure that, in many ways, despite the fact that we're here to talk about common sense, his sort of origin story gets lost in the memory of the Revolution, the story of the Revolution. He's born in 1737 in Thetford, in Norfolk, in England. He's the son of a staymaker. He later apprentices to his father, so he's making corsets and things like that. He does a little bit of a tour of duty at sea for a while, and then in the 1750s he opens up his own business and he gets married. They're expecting a child, and unfortunately, in a kind of repetitive action throughout Paine's life, every time things are going well for him, things begin to go south very quickly. Unfortunately, his wife Mary dies, so does their child. His business collapses. And so in the 1760s, ironically enough, since we're talking about the American Revolution, which is in a sense a revolt about taxation, Thomas Paine becomes a tax collector. He's an excise collector, first in Lincolnshire, and then he's not very good at it. He actually gets fired. He is, and again, ironically, for the American Revolution, he is a stamp duties customs collector, and so he gets canned because he doesn't bother to actually inspect some of the goods he's supposed to, and his bosses find out about it. So he gets fired, bounces around for a little bit, manages to get an appointment once again as a tax collector, this time in Lewis and Sussex, where for about 6 or so years things are going fairly well for him. He gets remarried to a woman named Elizabeth. He begins working for her father's grocery business, so things are looking like things are on the up and up a little bit. And importantly, he begins to write something very important for our purposes, but he begins to write. He writes a 95-page pamphlet at one point that's about the rights of juries. He later writes a pamphlet in 1772 that's about arguing for better pay and better working conditions for excise collectors. But then once again, things begin to go south for Paine. He runs into financial trouble. His business fails. He and his wife separate, and so in 1774 he's in a lot of trouble. He owes a ton of money. The debt collectors are after him. He's trying to avoid being in debtor's prison. Manages to avoid that by selling almost all of his assets. And it's in that year that he has a kind of a chance encounter with Benjamin Franklin, who's in London, Lindsay, as you know, at that point, as a what they call an agent on behalf of colonies like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts Bay, essentially a lobbyist. He's trying to represent their interests before the king's ministers in Whitehall. And he gets a letter of recommendation from Franklin because Paine has decided to go to America because he's got nothing going. In England by this point, his life is crap, his prospects are poor, and he's like, well, what the hell? Might as well try British America because real Britain isn't so great for me right now. And he gets that letter from Franklin, and because Franklin is arguably the most important and famous American in the world at this point, that letter carries a lot of weight. And he ends up in Philadelphia in 1774.
I think it's so interesting to think about what might have happened stories, the roads not taken. What if George Washington had received a commission in the British Army? What if Thomas Paine's life hadn't fallen apart? Not that we can really totally go down them. We don't have time tonight or know what would happen. That's always a great what if of what, might have history, what might have gone differently if they had taken a different path. So when he gets to Philadelphia in 1774, of course, the revolutionary fervor is not revolutionary fervor, the protests are in full swing, especially depending on where you are, especially in Philadelphia. There have been protests over the Stamp Act. There have been protests over sugar. There have been all these things. And by 1774, the first Continental Congress was meeting in the city. So he's really in the heart of what is happening here. And now we don't really, he is participating in the city. We don't have great records about always what he's doing because at this point he's not always a well-known historic figure yet. But in January 1776, he publishes a pamphlet. So we're going to talk a little bit about the actual, what it looked like, how it was consumed. But let's maybe start with setting some of the scene of what were some of the things that the colonists were discussing, what was happening at this point. We know about the pamphlet because it changed minds, but why were we set up for a place where minds likely changed?
Yeah, how do we get there? 1774 is kind of a pivotal year in many ways. I mean, when Paine arrives, he starts working for the Pennsylvania Magazine, starts editing it and writing for it. And he's, as he was in England, he's very attentive to what we might call working class conditions. So he's thinking very much about, how the political situation is affecting regular people and how he can communicate his ideas in kind of clear, plain language. But to your excellent point, what's happening in 1774 is a number of things. As you said, the Continental Congress begins meeting. There is a first serious attempt to create a kind of pan-colonial unity not for the purpose of independence, but to come
Mm-hmm.
up with a viable solution or strategy that will essentially convince Parliament to back down, that can reset the empire to where it was in 1763, and that British Americans can stay British Americans. When the Virginians go to Philadelphia, or they set out for Philadelphia, they take with them a set of instructions from one Thomas Jefferson, or he intends it as a set of instructions. And he writes a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And I think it'd be fascinating for our listeners and our viewers to read that pamphlet alongside
Mm-hmm.
Common Sense, because what Jefferson says in that pamphlet is he lays out this kind of wonderful Jefferson sense of the long history of colonization as he
Mm-hmm.
understands it. I mean, if you wanted some Jefferson on Anglo-Saxon history summary view of the rights of British America is your jam. But putting that
Well,
aside,
who doesn't want that all the time? I mean, really, isn't that your desired nighttime reading?
as somebody who has studied Jefferson's legal history and who has read far more about his Anglo-Saxon philosophy than anyone ever should, I can tell you that yes, you will find a rich corpus there, but you might be a corpse by the time that you finish reading it at the end of the day. But the important part of what he's got, he lays out a summary, right? It's why it's wonderfully called A Summary View of the Rights of British America, because Jefferson articulates kind of the central points that British Americans, like himself, like John Adams, like George Washington, like John Dickinson in Philadelphia, have been arguing since Parliament first began to tax the colonies, which is
Mm-hmm.
that Parliament has no right to do this. When the colonists first came to North America in the 17th century, they brought with them the rights of Englishmen, and that entailed the right to tax themselves. And that the king is he's the father of the empire, right? He is the head of Great Britain, but he's also the head of Virginia and Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island and
Mm-hmm.
Providence plantations. They Jefferson envisions a kind of federal union, a kind of federal empire. And Jefferson and many British Americans want the king to intervene. They believe that his constitutional duty is to say to Parliament, you have overstepped your authority. You should not be attempting to tax the crown or the colonies. Jefferson is pleading in Summary View, as are many British Americans. He says at one point, open your breast, sire, to liberal and expanded thought. Let not the name of George III be a blot on the page of history. And this is a kind of sentiment that you see in
Mm-hmm.
many different forms throughout the colonies, as you know. But it's not working because British Americans, struggle to understand that George III has a very different sense of duty
Mm-hmm.
than they think he should have, and that he supports Parliament. And so you're starting to see a shift in sentiment by 74 a little bit, but certainly after the war begins in April of 1775, because the fundamental question of the first 15 months of the conflict is, what is this war for?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we fighting? Even as late as in November of 1775, Jefferson is still writing to London and saying, there's still a way out of this. It's on you guys, but we can
Mm-hmm.
do it. But things are beginning to set in motion. And the other thing I think we need to consider by this point, the war is going very badly for the rebels. Sure, Lexington and Concord was a skirmish, and you could kind of maybe call that a marginal victory. Bunker Hill was a Pyrrhic victory for the British, but a victory nonetheless. But 10 days before Paine publishes Common Sense, the Americans suffer a catastrophic defeat in Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
where they're trying to essentially make Quebec the 14th colony. They tried first to convince them politely through a series of letters.
Wait,
then they said, well,
wait. Canada did not want to be a part of the United States?
fascinatingly enough, they have rejected our invitation several times over the course of the last 250 years.
Outrage.
And you think they would have said yes to Benedict Arnold in late 1775 and Philip Schuyler and then Richard Montgomery, but Richard Montgomery paid the price for that assertion, unfortunately for him. So they retreat. Canada's a total catastrophe. There's no clear sense of why we're fighting this war.
Mm-hmm.
There's no clear sense that there can be reconciliation at this point. What are we going to do?
Excellent setting the scene. Couple of other pieces I just want to mention. So the idea you talked about of like the legal theory of the king being sort of the head of the colonies and parliament, it's almost a precursor to what we think of today as like the Commonwealth system,
Right.
in which the king is, in theory, the head of state of Australia and Canada and also Great Britain. Now, that's a little bit more of a loose relationship than they were envisioning, but I think it is another one of these counterfactuals it's worth thinking about. By the end of the war, the British were offering basically the Commonwealth, and at that point, now Americans are saying, "Nice try, too late." Basically, had they offered that earlier, it almost certainly would have avoided the war, I think.
I think
The
so. Yeah.
second piece that I think is worth mentioning is at this point, uh, Great Britain had just won an overwhelming victory against the French Empire. It was
Hmm.
the largest navy in the world. It was the most powerful empire. It was something that, until recently, most Americans had been incredibly proud of and incredibly proud to be a part of. We have the benefit of knowing what comes next. We have the benefit of knowing how it worked out. And we have the benefit of knowing that insurgent wars generally are really, really hard to win.
Right.
They did not know that. And so when they're thinking about what is this war for? Why are we doing it? How are we going to try and gain leverage? Is it worth, like, how do we declare independence? Why would we declare independence? They're thinking about those odds as nearly impossible. And
Yeah.
so when we think about this moment, when we think about any time in the revolutionary period, I think our biggest challenge is pushing back on the sense of inevitability or the
Hmm.
sense of outcome that we know that they very much did not.
I think that's right. Like, and I try to stress to my students and whenever I give public talks, it's hard for us to imagine how deeply proud colonists were to be British.
Yes.
They least taxed, this so the old saw, right? Least tax freest people on earth. Of course, not everyone is free by 500,000 enslaved people in North America at this time, or at least in the British
Mhm.
colonies. But they, as you rightly say, at the end of the Seven Years' War, the French of Indian War in 1763, they are euphoric. They think that they have finally done what they have long dreamed to do. They have created this British Empire that will serve them well in the future. And then 12 years later, it falls apart.
Mhm.
Nobody
Absolutely.
sees that coming. Nobody sees
No,
it coming.
no. So let's talk a little bit about the publication. So the
Yeah.
pamphlet comes out. Most sources that I see say January 10th, but there's some confusion about whether it's January 9th or January 10th. So we're going to call it later this week, 250 years ago. A small pamphlet is printed. It is initially printed as anonymous.
Yep.
The author is anonymous. And this is essential because one of the backstory elements of Tom Paine that I think is so interesting is that while he was working as a writer, he wrote pamphlets on behalf of other writers that had been imprisoned and their presses seized for criticizing the king. And that's because there wasn't a First Amendment, there wasn't freedom of speech. Under a monarchical system, critical speech was not just disagreement, it was disloyalty or worse, treason. And so when you're thinking about that, you're not going to always put your name on a pamphlet. And, I think in this moment, when there are a lot of pressures on freedom of speech, that is worth thinking about. So the pamphlet comes out, it is anonymous. One of the things that makes it so amazing is that it is language that anyone can really understand. You don't have to
Yeah.
have an education to comprehend what he's saying, unlike some of the things written by Jefferson or some of the other revolutionary writers that are sort of higher ideals. And it is also written in such a way that lends itself to be read aloud because a
Hmm.
lot of people, I mean, the United States or future United States, the American colonies had really high rates of literacy for the time, but there were still a lot of people who were not literate or couldn't afford to buy a pamphlet. And so it was common practice that you would buy a pamphlet if you could afford it, bring it home, read it around the hearth, or take it to a local tavern, or you would go to a local tavern to hear it read. And we actually see in letters, like when John Quincy Adams is writing home to his mother or his brother, he'll say, like, here's news to share around the hearth. Like it's quite literally to be read by the fireplace. So that's how a lot of people consumed it. It's a very powerful language read aloud. But not everyone necessarily felt that it was powerful in a good way. What was the Loyalist response to common
Yeah.
sense?
Well, it's interesting. James Chalmers of Maryland tries to write a response called Plain Truth, and it expresses sentiments that are fairly consistent with the Loyalist position. So, for example, if we look at Thomas Paine's Common Sense, um, and I'll just read a passage here for a second because I think it's actually kind of apropos of what the Loyalists are arguing against, right? So Thomas Paine says in Common Sense, and I love this passage, but where, say some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Great Britain. Yet, that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America law is king. For as in absolute government, the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought not to be no other. So what Paine is saying, essentially, is that it is common sense, that it is fundamentally unnatural, it is contrary to the law of nature and nature's God, that someone like George III should be the ruler of a free people by virtue of just being born to the right family.
Mm-hmm.
The Loyalists' position, and you'll hear a lot of them say this, they will say that the American Revolution or the rebellion is an unnatural rebellion. And so what they're arguing is that the the rebels are essentially defying the natural social order that begins with the great chain of being, beginning with God, on down through the monarch, through the gentry, aristocracy, and the common people, down to the meanest and lowest of them all. And if you violate that natural order, you're not only defying your monarch, you're defying God himself. So you start to see, particularly in New York, they're using this phrase, the unnatural rebellion. And Paine says, no, you dummies. The it is in fact unnatural to have a king.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to spend, a few pages telling you why that's the case.
Well, and he lays out like these examples, and I think it's really smart the way he does it, because he says, like, there may be men among us who deserve special honors, that are worthy of this type of power and incredible access to authority. But what is the likelihood that their sons would? And that's a very common sense question. It's a question that everyone has met someone who is amazing and they have a child that is stupid. And so you're like, how is this possible? Obviously, I don't write that way, but to use my own common sense language, everyone has had that experience. Yeah. And he also, I love what he does about one of the things that he's talking about with kings that I think resonates so much with me today, that makes this document such a timeless one, is he talks about how the system of monarchy doesn't really make sense, because if you're going to rule on behalf of all of the people, you have to have access to a lot of information in order to be able to rule on their behalf. But inherently, a monarchical system separates the king from people and from information, and makes it harder for them to know what is happening. And that is, when we talk, we kind of, in the history world, when we talk about leadership and when we talk about presidents, we talk about the best presidents, Washington and Lincoln. They're the ones that surround themselves with people who are willing to tell them no, that are willing to give them that information to break down those walls. And so I think that is a form of leadership that everyone kind of understood and felt very accessible to them.
Well, no, I think that's right. And to your excellent point about the roll of the dice with sons, right? Think about George III, and whatever the Americans are saying about him in this period, historically we know he's not a tyrant in the way that they would characterize it. He's actually deeply committed to the outcome of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and to constitutional government and whatnot. But his son George IV, who becomes George IV, the Prince of Wales at the time, is, to put
ridiculous.
Ridiculous. It's just a.
There was not an excess that he met that he did not take to excess.
money, food, women, wine.
Architecture,
Architecture.
fashion, everything.
To put it politely, he's an interesting character. But what Paine does so brilliantly is
He wore a
actually
corset
yes, yes,
because he
yes.
had to.
And I'll just a short sort of shout out for our friends at the Georgian Papers program, where you can read the digitized volumes of the Georgian kings, including all of the expense accounts of what George IV is spending to fund all of his choice habits. It's delicious historical reading. So next holiday, you can all spend your time doing that. But I like what you say about Paine, because you're right. He's able to explain why monarchy is wrong, or make an argument for why monarchy is unnatural, particularly for British Americans, because he's drawing on common sense philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
right? The pamphlet is called Common Sense, but he is doing this in an intellectual climate in the 18th century where there's these strains of thought called common sense philosophy. And I'll sort of just very briefly try to sketch that out, because ironically, or hilariously, even though it's called common sense, it's not common sense to understand. But essentially what happens, there's two strains of thought. One comes from Scotland, one of my favorite places, particularly from Edinburgh and from Aberdeen, where philosophers in the 18th century create this notion of Scottish common sense realism. And the argument that they have is that there are certain innate truths that are knowable, that regular ordinary individuals are fully capable of drawing on a body of knowledge that is common to amongst all people, and that they can make informed decisions based off that body of knowledge. The other strain of thought is coming from continental Europe. And from that, they get this idea, or Paine gets this idea, that institutions or long held truths aren't necessarily true just because they've been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. So, for example, it's not necessarily true that a monarch like George III should be king just because of who he is and who he was born to. Mm-hmm. So Paine very brilliantly merges these two ideas in his pamphlet and is able to articulate these and tap into this innate sense that is held, he thinks, and many other people think, that it is common sense that America should not be ruled by a king and that America should be independent. And that, as you say, resonates with people.
It does. The line that I love the most, and so he not only argues against existing ideas, like you said, but he argues for people to take action. He encourages them to set aside the notion that peace can still be maintained with Great Britain, that the king is interested in having, a peaceful resolution, and encourages them to seek out independence. And the line he uses, I think, means so much because it should apply to every generation of Americans, which is that we have it in our power to make the world again. And he genuinely believed that they did in that generation. But the whole point of a republic is that you have it in the power to make the world again, because with every vote, with every action, you are in sense creating something again and new. And that is an incredibly powerful idea.
A new birth of freedom, you might say.
Indeed.
Lincoln had to show up at some point.
Obviously. Well, we did get a team of rivals in there, and I saw someone call it out in the comments. So we're 2 for 2 on Lincoln references.
Very nice. Yeah, exactly. Well, Lindsay, I'm curious, because you have spent a lot of time, and you really kindly pointed out that I had read your manuscript for the cabinet. You spent a lot of time with George Washington. Gee, I wonder about who Paine was talking about in Common Sense, that some men could be trusted with power. It's always been a struggle for me to understand the sort of reception amongst Washington, what he thinks about common sense, but particularly the Continental Army in this kind of perilous moment. We can talk certainly about the general populace, and we've kind of already touched on it, but at the end of the day, the Continental Army is fighting the war. Independence is not achievable unless that army survives.
Yeah.
What effect are you seeing on that body?
Well, it definitely has an impact. Washington ordered copies of it and then actually hired Paine to come and be amongst the troops and sort of write dispatches back about the experience, sort of like who's the example I'm thinking of? We've seen this in several generations of war where you have like the war correspondents writing back, and it's both sort of propaganda for the people at home, but it's also morale for the troops. And so Washington hired Paine to serve that role. And it was particularly important because, as you said, by January 1776, the army had been, especially the troops from Massachusetts, had been in the field at that point for almost 9 months. And most of them were militiamen. Most of them were sort of subsistence farmers, or what we would call subsistence farmers. They didn't have a lot of enslaved labor at home that they could just like leave to take care of their farm. And so when they left, they were sacrificing their family's livelihood and well-being because there was one less set of hands to actually till the ground and sow the crops and bring them in at harvest. And so a lot of them wanted to go home later on in the year. One of the reasons that Trenton and Princeton is so important is because right around that time, a lot of the enlistments were about to expire, and so Washington used this like one last mad dash to try and inspire people to stay on, so his army wouldn't literally disintegrate. And so things like common sense were really important for the troops because they boosted morale. It reminded them or put into words maybe what they were feeling, but didn't totally know about why they were there. Those moments were essential to buoying their hopes. Another one that we see occurred on July 9th, which is when Washington had jumping ahead here, spoiler alert, when the Declaration of Independence is indeed announced, and Washington had it read to the army on July 9th. And as the story goes, they were so inspired that they participated in the pulling down of the statue of King George III, which was in New York City, and then melted it down to turn it into bullets. So those types of morale moments, especially when the war isn't going well, are essential to continuing an 8-year endeavor. And so that awareness of speaking to the common man, of not just having the leaders, is, I think, so essential. And it's one of the challenges as we look forward to the 250th, recognizing like how do we reach a lot of different people with this history? Because, you and I are history junkies. We are obviously very aware of the anniversary. And sometimes I find myself telling people like, oh, 26 is going to be such a big deal. And depending on who I'm talking to, they'll either say, oh, why? Because of the midterm elections, or if they're political junkies, or, oh, yes, of course they know what I'm talking about, or they don't know. And it's because it's not that they're not interested. It hasn't registered for them yet. So how can we, in this moment, how can we help it register for people? And, one thought that I had was in 1776, you need a Thomas Paine, you need a John Dickinson, you need eventually an Alexander Hamilton. You need all of the different types speaking to different audiences. And so this is where I would love for you to talk a little bit about what In Pursuit is doing. And it's kind of it's almost the way I think of like speaking to a lot of different audiences in one project.
Yeah, it's a great question because you're right. We don't have a singular Thomas Paine-like voice in this moment, but what we do have is 250 years of history to reflect on. In a very, let's be honest, very difficult moment in our nation's history. Unfortunately, so as we're entering this anniversary, but that doesn't mean that we sit quietly and sit in our hands and not think about the past and how we can make a better future. And so In Pursuit is a project of More Perfect, which is a national civics organization. And the project, which I joined in October of last year, very fortunate to do so, is run by Colleen Shogan, who many of our listeners will know is the 11th Archivist of the United States. And, I take no credit for this.
Archivist too.
And the first women archivist too. And I take no credit for this at all because it was already set up by the time I got here, because Colleen and the team assembled something like 72 authors at this point, including yourself. And we can talk about John Quincy Adams here in a little bit, maybe, but 72 authors to write short essays about key figures and public servants in American history, starting with the presidents, former presidents, and first ladies, with the idea being that we can look to the past, we can look to America's past to write the history of America's future.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a reflective moment that we should take stock, but also decide how we're going to move forward as a nation and as a people. And the stories that we tell, or the stories that our contributors are telling, and it's a mix of historians, such as yourself, prominent journalists like John Meacham, um, public servants like President Obama, Mrs. Bush, Secretary Clinton, President Clinton, looking at these figures, some of which are their predecessors, looking at challenges that they've faced during their time in office or over the time or the course of their lives, and extracting from those moments
Mm-hmm.
guiding lights, signposts, things that can serve as wayfinders as we try to form a more perfect union still. And I think importantly, this isn't a project that is about necessarily the greatness of America. It is about the understanding America in a very
Mm-hmm.
real and visceral way. So there will be stories of triumph, but there will also be stories of tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Think, for example, of James Buchanan, who essentially let the Union fragment in 1859 and into 1860. So we've got a lot to learn. This is phase one of the project. We're starting with the low-hanging fruit of the former presidents and first ladies, but phase two, we're going to be going much more expansively and looking at all different kinds of Americans. In addition into the essays, which we'll be publishing on Substack, and you can learn more about that at inpursuit.org. We're going to have teacher resources. We're going to have mini documentaries that we're producing. We're going to have a podcast of which you know something about, Lindsay. And it's an exciting opportunity for me as someone who spends all of their time in the 18th century to think about figures who I've only cursory read about over the course of my life and career, and to understand people in ways that I had not before, and to figure out what my own role in this is, not just in the project, but in trying to move the country forward as best as we possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're after. We're starting a conversation to create the possibility for a better future.
Awesome. Love that.
Period.
Yes. Well, I think, for me, when people say, like, how do you want to celebrate the 250th? How are you thinking of the 250th? I think for me, obviously, the anniversary of the Constitution is not for another 11 years, but
We'll get there.
We'll get there. But the line to create a more perfect union is basically the second sentence after the Declaration of Independence. If the Declaration of Independence is outlining the original principles, which I think common sense does in a different way,
Yeah.
the Constitution is then, okay, let's take a crack at it. Let's see if we can actually try and get a little bit closer. And I see so many of these essays, the lessons learned from them, because they are really, what I love about them is they're all organized around one essay, around one lesson. And each person picks their own lesson, but the lesson is sometimes either a failure of that or moving that goalpost a little bit closer. And that is, I think, I hope the right mix of honest about moments where we have failed, but still hopeful because the story isn't finished and we are continuing to write it. And so we can make it a little bit more perfect every single day. And so I reject the either completely triumphalentism, whatever the word. It's fine. I'm making words up. It's okay. The completely celebratory or the completely despondent versions of American history, because I don't think either are actually accurate.
No, democracy takes work. And if you're not willing to work at democracy, you're not worthy of the republic that was founded in the 18th century, or the principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence or the Revolution, which I think is a sort of fascinating thing that we see throughout this project. And it goes right back to common sense, because the idea of common sense doesn't doesn't end in the 18th century. It carries forward. I mean,
Mhm.
the individual you're writing about, John Quincy Adams, has this wonderful speech when he's Secretary of State that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. For him, that's common sense. I mean, and not to give the people a little bit of a preview of what's to come in your essay and also in your podcast interview. That's a fabulous mug, by the way. Well done.
Thank you.
Um, what does John Quincy Adams mean by that?
Yes. So, what I love about John Quincy Adams, and this ties so well into the conversation we're having today. So, John Quincy Adams was around when Common Sense was published. He first comes into the history books when his mom, Abigail, who also another essay on Abigail, um, she takes him to a nearby hill to watch the Battle of Bunker Hill. And first of all, I'm not really sure that's like, PG viewing, but neither here nor there. So he's watching this battle. He's watching people getting killed when he's quite young. I think he's like 7 or 8.
Yeah, yes.
She has a different rating system than I think most parents today. And he leaves the history books when he's in Congress. He dies when literally in Congress on the U.S. Capitol, and Abraham Lincoln's desk is like 3 desks down. So that
Yeah.
scope of history is ginormous, which is a term of historic science.
Proportions.
And yes, exactly. And along the way, so he is the tie from the Revolution to the Civil War, and he is the tie from these ideas to how does the Union actually survive. And he thinks deeply and hard about what it takes for a union to survive, a union based on ideas, not based on race, not based on shared ethnicity, not based on shared religion. And he had seen nations with those shared origins and understood that the United States was trying to do something different. And so my essay is looking at what was his vision of what the United States should be, and what was his vision of what the United States' role in the world should be, especially as it gets more powerful. And this was a both an idealistic and deeply pragmatic vision, which was that we have these founding principles. They're incredibly important. They're in the Declaration of Independence. We can't abandon them because they need to be our North Star. But we also have to live in the real world. And so what he was basically arguing was that we should neither be imperialist and go abroad to try and enforce our principles, monsters to destroy, seek out wars that have really nothing to do with us. However, we should also not hide at home. We should not be isolationist because as a nation, we had great potential, and that potential required us to engage in the world. He believed that we needed to support our allies, but that allies that shared our principles were generally going to be better friends than those who had very different principles. And above all, he believed that the Union was stronger as one than as many. And so he opposed things like the Mexican-American War that he thought would be a division or would undermine the sanctity of the Union in some way. And so that was his vision. I think it's an incredibly prescient one. He really saw it as the successor of George Washington's farewell address. He actually explicitly claims the mantle of being George Washington's ideological successor when he's president. But this most famous speech, the Monsters to Destroy one, was a July 4th address when he was Secretary of State. And it's a remarkable speech. It's incredibly relevant for this current moment because he also was the author as Secretary of State of the Monroe Doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the creator of that vision. And so, man, I'm also working on a book on this subject. Man, I wish it would come out tomorrow, but alas, it will not. Thankfully, the essay will be out before then.
I've always had a soft spot for JQA because he had great aspirations to build, a national university, for education, to build. I love space, so he wanted to build like a national astronomy setup, but also just his photographs from the late 19th century when he does not care. Does not care is the cantankerous old man. He is hammering away at Southern oligarchs in Congress about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
They can't do anything to him, and he just has these just delicious photographs where.
Well, as you have heard me say before, he has no F's left to give. This is my official take on John Quincy Adams as a congressman towards the end of his life.
which was the title of your forthcoming book, I imagine, right?
Obviously. Yes, I'm sure
It's
Basic Books would be very happy about that. No F's left to give. That's not what they signed
uh,
on for. All right. Well, we are coming to the tail end of our time. We've actually blown over it, but how can one talk about common sense in such a short a period of time? So, a couple of things, friends. I think a lot of you have come are already subscribers, but if not, we would love if you would subscribe to In Pursuit, subscribe to Imperfect Union, which is my newsletter, comes out once a month. Um, Let me know if you enjoy this kind of thing. As I said, it's the first time we've done it. You can send me an email. You can leave a message on, I think this then generates a post on my page. Clearly, I'm really
it does,
very
yeah.
savvy about this. So leave a comment if this is something you would like me to do again with Jim, or we can figure out other sort of historic dates to discuss. I don't know. Seems like a fun idea. So let me know. Would love your feedback. But let's talk a little bit about both More Perfect and Mount Vernon 250th programming. So, Jim, what do you guys have on tap?
Yeah, I'm terribly excited. We're about to launch, well, not about to launch, but in next month, on February 16th, President's Day, we will launch In Pursuit with the first essay about George Washington, the first president, written by President George W. Bush, the second George W., if you will. And I think the president is going to deliver quite it's a wonderful essay. It really speaks to the past 250 years. It speaks to Washington and his actions, both as commander in chief and as president. And it speaks to the leadership that we need in the United States in this moment and going forward. And that will kick us off. Karen Wolf, the director of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, her wonderful essay on Martha Washington will be next. And then we're off to the races. So I would encourage all of your listeners, who hopefully are now our listeners as well, to sign up at inpursuit.org. Sign up for our Substack so you can get those essays, which will be published weekly beginning in February. And we're going to start our grand tour of the past, as I said, to try to write the history of America's future. And Mount Vernon has been great partners in this. We've got a lot of things in the works with both yourself and Mount Vernon. More largely, I used to work at Mount Vernon, so I'm very delighted to be once again associated with you all.
Moment.
Full circle, right? Exactly. Just like we're circling back to emails at the first of the year, I'm circling back to Mount Vernon in a different capacity. But tell us a little bit about what's up at Mount Vernon for the 250th.
Going to be a busy year. So we just fully reopened. We were never closed, but we fully reopened the entire restored mansion, which really just looks phenomenal. I mean, there are spaces that have been restored to a higher quality than they had been since 1799 when Washington died. So it's really, the house looks incredible. We will be opening a brand new museum in the spring that is massive. It's a biography of George Washington in his lifetime, and I think will be really enjoyable and will feature primary source documents and great digital resources. So definitely come visit in person if you can. At the George Washington Presidential Library, we are going to be hosting, of course, our regular lineup of events, which is quite numerous. We have all of our book talks, trying to have the biggest books on the Revolution that we can, as well as two sort of flagship events, one in the spring, which is called the Women's Leadership Summit, which we will be posting the link to this week. Colleen Shogan will be presenting at that. Then it looks at women's role in preserving history, sharing history, shaping American memory and legacy from the founding to today. So, think First Ladies and civics organizations and preservation. And then in the fall, we will be hosting a democracy symposium that looks at I've identified as the 9 contributions that Washington made to the nation, things from the presidency, constitution, peaceful transfer of power, civil control of the military, religious freedom, et cetera, and the history of them, and then where they are today. So almost all of that will be available online as well. Please feel free to check out our website, which is mountvernon.org/library. I will continue to write about all of this personally on imperfectunion.substack.com, which you should have the link to because I think it's right in front of you or in the bar that you're looking at on your phone or your computer, but nonetheless, it's there if not. So it'll be a big year. It's an exciting one, and I'm really hopeful I think the opportunity it presents to the nation is great. I am hopeful that the next 11 years are a civic renaissance, much like they were for the founding generation from 1776 to 1787. So I'm hopeful that we're starting that. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining me. This was great fun. It seems as though there's a request to do more of them. So we'll have to look at some of our other historic anniversaries and see what else we can come up with. Thank
Well,
you
we have many
all.
books. You've got many
Yeah,
books.
just a few.
We'll
I'll see what
just
we
pick
can
a
do.
topic, and we'll do it something else.
Thank you all for being our little guinea pigs. We really appreciate. I don't know why this is my guinea pig motion. I've now done this like 4 times.
It
We
works.
really clearly that's what guinea pigs do. We really appreciate you all. We appreciate you being here. Is a delight. I hope you all had a wonderful start to the new year, and happy new year to you all from here on out. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.